Hello, and welcome to Transmission X. I'm your host, Nate Allen. The date, February 10th, 2024. This is the 8th transmission. A transmission is a signal sent from one person or place to another. It is my hope that this signal provide you a beacon so that you may find what it is that was meant to find you. You have tuned into this frequency. It is not in error, so stay tuned, but most importantly, be ready. Today, we are continuing to shed light on a crime so big a president of the United States had to apologize to a nation. Today we will hear the stories from self-proclaimed victims of the CIA's Project MKUltra and delve into the sub-project, Project Monarch. Tonight's transmission may be a lot longer than previous transmissions, as I'm going to tell two stories from the victims' perspectives. If this is your first time listening to the transmission, I suggest you go back and catch up through previous transmissions so that you do not fall behind and so that you are aware and understand the subject matter. A lot of this information you will hear today may seem fantastical, but keep an open mind, or maybe don't, for the mind needs to be protected at all costs. Even if you don't believe the stories you are about to hear, remember that the controllers, the string pullers, the rulers, the powerful, have been seeking control of your minds since the beginning of recorded time. One of the earliest writings giving reference to the use of occultism to manipulate the mind can be found in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It is a compilation of rituals heavily studied by today's secret societies, which describes methods of torture and intimidation to create trauma, the use of potions or drugs, and the casting of spells, hypnotism, ultimately resulting in the total enslavement of the initiate. Other events ascribed to black magic, sorcery, and demon possession are all the forefathers of MKUltra Monarch programming. The term Monarch is a curious one. Scientists have learned that the Monarch genetically passes on to its offspring the exact location where it was born, the first trauma it remembers genetically. And in alleged victims of Monarch programming, there seems to be a history of sexual trauma, violence, and mental trauma. Is this the way of ingraining childhood trauma and creating real generational curses? The U.S. government used parapsychology, hypnosis, the power of suggestion, as well as channeling in the beginning with Dr. Puharich, then mixed more technology such as extremely low frequencies, drugs, and then there was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb and many mixtures of all of these, as well as electroshock therapy. And then there were many more doctors, such as Dr. Cameron in Canada and British psychiatrist William Sargantrum. Remember how I mentioned in the last transmission that Alan Dulles had brought over Nazis by way of Project Paperclip? There are those that say that this is all where it started, that these are continuations of Dr. Mengele and his work in the concentration camps, his techniques, his research, supposedly never stopped. Did I mention that Sidney Gottlieb presided over Dr. Mengele in Auschwitz? From universities to brothels to laboratories to those in the public eye, the controllers, in conjunction with military-industrial complex and with aid from previous Nazi research and ancient occult practices, have been waging war on the minds of mankind. It was all supposed to end in 1963, but in 1974, a Defense Department contractor, Jay Scapitz, sought to combine MKUltra technology with microwave technology to produce mass effects on the world's populace. And, interestingly enough, microwaves are used in spacecraft communication, and much of the world's data, television, and telephone communications are transmitted long distances by microwaves between ground stations and communication satellites. In 1988, the United States government finally settled an 8-year lawsuit brought against them by Washington attorneys Joseph L. Raw Jr. and James C. Turner. The suit was settled out of court for the meager sum of $750,000 and was on the behalf of only 8 Canadian citizens who were victimized and survived MKUltra experimentation, conducted by Dr. Ewan Cameron, who also achieved notoriety as the president of the American and Canadian Psychological Association. You see, they always promote the monsters. They always promote, high five, give credit to those from within. These are the ones you see all the time, winning the awards, the medals, having the dinners, and then they get the money. Once they get the approvals from the rulers, what we see is what they give us. And remember, just like in 1988, when they decide not to offer up information, they will settle out of court in the interest of national security. That is until a victim, a whistleblower, someone they weren't expecting, arrives out of the darkness. Then, like roaches, like parasites, they scatter, they do anything that they can to evade the light. Well, it has happened with a vengeance. The victims started calling themselves targeted individuals, and we'll hear accounts from a couple TIs from the beginning of MKUltra all the way up to present day. Once you hear their stories, it seems that they and thousands like them are still a part of an ongoing experiment of complete mental and potential spiritual control. Remember, it's always about control. In the words of political plant and former California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, screw your freedom. The controllers have never stopped their assault on freedom, especially not freedom of the mind. The testimonies of the victims, which you are about to hear from, describe processes that attempts to control human sovereignty via trauma, force, and total manipulation. Let's begin. We'll start with the first MKUltra targeted individual and survivor that I have come across. And her name is Candy Jones. Candy Jones was born on December 31st, 1925 in Atlantic City, New Jersey as Jessica Arlene Wilcox. As a child, it has been written that Jessica was born to a wealthy family, but was severely abused, mostly physically and mentally. Her parents would beat her and lock her in a dark room. But while locked in that dark room, all by herself, Jessica would visualize her friends appearing in large numbers. And they'd all fade away. As she looked into a dark mirror, they would all fade away but one. This wasn't one of her friends from school. This was a different version of Jessica. This was her first alter, or other personality. She described her as the opposite of herself and more like her mother, tough, ruthless, sarcastic, and cruel, with a low, grating voice, always trying to control things. She named her, or to her, her name was Arlene, and she stayed with Jessica, always attempting to gain dominance. Jessica would live with this and would go on to graduate from high school and then enter and win Miss Atlantic City. She was a blonde bombshell in the 1940s, and she was about 6'4" in height. You couldn't miss her. And this, when she found a little bit of success, is when she changed her name to Candy Jones. She became a hit, one of the premier pinup girls of the 40s, and a favorite of the American soldiers in World War II. While touring military bases with the United States organizations, or the USO, in 1945, Candy became ill with undulant fever and malaria, and was put in a special hospital in the Philippines. This is when she met her first actual groomer. He waltzed into the hospital room and introduced himself as a medical officer by the name of Gilbert Jensen. In actuality, he was the very successful hypnotist and psychologist, Dr. William S. Kroger. This is one introduction Candy probably wished she never had, as he shows back up in a very damaging way later in her life. She recovered from her sickness and then went on to marry a model agency owner by the name of Harry Conover. After having 3 children, they were divorced by 1959. Candy then owned her own modeling agency and would be approached by the FBI during this time to use her office as a mail drop location. She agreed and really just thought she was doing her patriotic duty. In the 60s, Candy started to then work for NBC Radio, owned by Talmudic Jew David Sarnoff. Remember, in that book, the Talmud, you and me, we are considered goyim. Cattle, sheep, were looked at as ripe for the slaughter. That is not an exaggeration. I highly recommend all of you to buy and read the Babylonian Talmud. You will understand better one of the greatest dangers the world has ever known. You will find an extension of the fallen in those Babylonian pages. In any event, let's get back to Candy, shall we? While at NBC, she met a very famous New York radio personality by the name of Long John Nebel. And in 1972, only 28 days after they met, they were married. Nebel would start to notice another side to his wife, however. This other side would be aggressive. She would snap at a moment's notice. Her voice would lower. And this other side came with sharp mood swings. He noticed his wife would also suffer from insomnia and not being able to sleep. His solution? Hypnosis. With no known training in hypnosis, he convinced Candy that he had read enough on the subject that he may be able to help. And he actually ended up hypnotizing Candy. And what came from these sessions, about 200 hours worth, were strange utterances, strange statements made by Candy. She would start speaking in a child's voice, but that wasn't the strangest thing. One day, Candy's old childhood mirror friend, Arlene, would come out, and Long John Nebel would be told a tale of past hypnosis and mind control. Apparently, during these sessions, her husband learned that while Candy was allowing the FBI to use her modeling agency as a drop location, she was asked to take a letter to a man in San Francisco. This man ended up being the old medical officer from her time with the USO, Gilbert Jensen, or Dr. Kroger. Once with him, she was asked to be an asset, acquiring a false identity. And of course, which one did they pick? Arlene Grant. Candy's old alter. During this Cold War time, many citizens were working for the company, as the CIA was called, and bound by non-disclosure agreements and more than likely by fear of CIA retribution. These assets and their roles remained a secret even from family and loved ones. The doctor would then tell Candy that she would need to be in good health and that he needed to give her certain vitamins intravenously. He would hypnotize Candy to bring out Arlene. Arlene would then attend CIA training camps. Keep in mind, Candy had no idea of her alter, but in these sessions, Arlene knew all about Candy and felt she was weak. Arlene was trained in the art of spycraft. She was trained to use weapons, such as firearms and even poisonous lipstick. She was sent on missions out of the country as a courier, and this was later corroborated by her editor, Joe Vergara, and her attorney, William Williams. At least her leaving to go to other countries and being or working for the government and not being able to give them any details. Obviously, they had no idea what Candy was really involved in. Candy grew tired of this work, and when she wanted to quit, the doctor felt that was too risky and planned for Candy to commit suicide. This tactic may be able to explain a lot, especially when you hear that certain people, in our time anyway, and in the past, were suicided. It was not to be that way for Candy, however. Marrying Long John Nebel was spontaneous and thwarted the doctor's plans. This and more of this story can be found in the book written by Donald Bain called The CIA's Control of Candy Jones. The next targeted individual we'll look at today is Cathy O'Brien. She has written all about her experience. Her book is titled Transformation of America, The True Life Story of a Mind Control Slave. There is also a very good documentary called Trance, Mind Control and Human Slavery, the Cathy O'Brien Story. She's also more recently been interviewed on the Roseanne Barr podcast, episode number 21. This story focuses on the subproject, Project Monarch, one of the most heinous sub-projects under the MKUltra umbrella. And so I must preface this next story with a warning This material is for adults. Listener discretion is advised. Cathy O'Brien was born December 4th, 1957. Her family was generational abuse-based family, meaning both her mother and father were sexually abused and continued to abuse Cathy and her siblings. From her own telling, she states that her dad used to even brag about sexually abusing her while she was just an infant. When she was 5, her dad was caught mailing child pornography and was approached by her uncle, her mom's brother, about selling Cathy to the government, the CIA in particular, to receive immunity from prosecution. She mentioned specifically that he was a trained Jesuit and a part of Air Force intelligence. The head Jesuit, she says, who was really in charge and made the call, was Cardinal Bernard Law of Boston, Massachusetts. He would end up being known for covering up sexual abuse and child rape within the Catholic Church. Cathy does say that not all Jesuits are bad and not all CIA are bad, but she mentions that they both contributed in many ways to her abuse. I agree with her, but remember, if you're familiar with the past transmissions, remember the Jesuit priest, Father Hell, who happened to push hypnotism? Wow, hasn't it come a long way? The adversary has no concept of time. He's doing a life sentence, and we're only here temporarily. In any event, it was a Jesuit that helped recruit Cathy into Project Monarch. And with the government, and the CIA in particular, a deal was made. By allowing this, her dad received no charges and would go from being a worm digger with a 6th grade education to a multimillionaire with government contracts. Cathy's real nightmare, if it wasn't bad enough already, was just beginning. Under Project MK Ultra, sub-Project Monarch, the methods used, a combination of psychology, cognitive neuroscience, trauma, and occult rituals to create within the victims alters or multiple personalities, which they could control using specific triggers. She stated that she was subjected to occult blood rituals, referred to as the right to remain silent. Right as in R-I-T-E. She said it was so awful that her mind readily accepted the mind manipulation she endured after the ritual. This is clinically referred to as trauma-based mind control. She was only a child, and as a child and going into adulthood, she had many handlers. Her first, though, went by the name Wayne Cox. She said that he was a CIA assassin and an occult serial killer under the Project Monarch. But then there would be Senator Robert C. Byrd, who would later become her owner. And then there would be President Gerald Ford, President Ronald Reagan, Hillary and Bill Clinton, Michigan Governor George Romney, whom interestingly enough would have her on an island like that of a more modern-day sex trafficker we are all familiar with. The island she points out in Michigan is Mackinac Island. She would also meet with Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, and her list goes on. Cathy also identifies the Blue Masonic Lodges as being the places where all of these different power brokers would meet. Cathy goes into detail about how these maniacal individuals plan to use the education system to implement mass mind control. And it was Senator Byrd, who was head of appropriations at the time, that really made our education system dependent on the federal government. In her personal story, Cathy goes into specifics about what she called the most dangerous game. Just like the short story, she claims it is very real. She recounts being dropped off at remote locations. I do have a clip. Give it a listen.
An extremely traumatizing MK Ultra mind control experience that I've had was the most dangerous game of human hunting. No matter what the weather, I didn't have any clothes and was turned loose in the woods and then literally hunted by men with guns, and never knowing whether or not I would actually be shot. They use hunting dogs to track which was really, really traumatic. And of course, it was kind of designed to where there's no place to run, no place to hide, because there was no way to get away from them. And it was at one of those human hunting places that I saw George Bush Jr. hunted just as I was. And his own father and Dick Cheney were a part of extreme trauma base for him because they were creating a Manchurian candidate.
Well, that definitely explains the dead eyes, the look on George Bush's face when he received the news in front of that class of children. I digress. That will be for another transmission. Cathy goes on to talk about how she was taken to the U.S. Virgin Islands and trafficked there as well, and now we know that to be where Epstein's crimes were being committed. She admits to having been ritually impregnated and made to have abortions for these rituals many times. When I say ritual, I mean satanic rituals. She was able to have her child, Kelly, but almost as a completion to her programming, her daughter was subject to testing and programming as well. Not only did Cathy live a nightmare, but she was forced to watch her daughter go through hell too. While she was being abused by Reagan, her poor 2-year-old daughter states that she would be with Bush, and she says this is just the way that it was. It is heart-wrenching. Her story goes much further, and for its time was mind-shattering, but as it is this day and age, more of what she says, more of what they were planning seems to be more and more true as time goes on. What she was speaking on is just now able to be comprehended by large numbers of people. Back then, she was just discredited, smeared, and just made out to be a conspiracy theorist. She has been blowing the whistle on satanic ritual abuse, mind control, incest, pedophilia, election rigging, and the perpetrators behind the crimes against humanity for years. As she can recount overhearing a conversation between George Bush and Bill Clinton, where they were actually planning for a young Bill Clinton to become president of the United States to further the aims of the New World Order. She claimed that Bill Clinton spoke about promoting genetic manipulation and so much more. The claims Cathy made were well ahead of her time, but luckily, she is still telling them to this day. Her last documentary, Trance, Mind Control, Human Slavery, and Healing the Nation, came out in 2022. Cathy may have seemed like a trafficked, mind-controlled prostitute by these maniacal maniacs, these controllers, but the memory they helped create seems to be currently working against them. Her and Candy's stories are only 2 of thousands. God works in mysterious ways. It is time that we stand up against secrecy, against the Jesuits, against the Zionists, against the rulers, the so-called leaders. If you wish to learn even more about targeted individuals and hear a more modern take on this ongoing horror, check out Vice Reports, Targeted Individuals. It's a documentary by Vice. These people may be being made out to be crazy, but the truth is written on your hearts. We know a victim when we hear them. It may just be that we don't understand how far ahead these rulers are in their techniques. It may just be that the idea of the term conspiracy theorist being the biggest boogeyman in the room may have just been the most successful suggestion we as a people have ever chosen to believe. What is being made obvious by Hollywood admissions, strange behavior, and Monarch and satanic symbolism is that Project Monarch, Project MK Ultra, lives on. In the next transmission, I'll reveal and continue to expose the underbelly of the beast, and surprisingly, you witness it every day in the limelight. Awareness will awaken, and truth will shine into the eyes of the blind, and whether they want it to or not, they too will have eyes to see. I'll leave you with a speech given by JFK, a man who was alleged to be part of the problem by a targeted individual I will name in the next transmission. Was he a part of the evil? Or was he just a president from a wealthy family? Was this speech a speech of dissent? And was his murder, which was but 10 days after this punishment, for the dissent? Well, you be the judge, and be the judge of everything that you have heard today. Please go look into this. Until next time, look for the Monarch in magazines. Look for the monarch butterfly on your celebrities. Look for the symbolism. They're on your most famous of friends. Look for the hourglass and the white rabbit. This symbolism is telling a story, and it may be leading us to unveiling the deceit, the horror, the rulers themselves. Here is JFK. Listen closely and be ready.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.